Seamus Taylor, on my far right, I first met in 2003 when he came to work as a Director of Equality and Diversity at the CPS during the time that I was DPP, and he fulfilled that role with huge distinction. Having left the CPS in 2009, he entered into an academic career. Seamus is now a lecturer in social policy at the National University of Ireland. He joined the Department of Applied Social Studies in 2009. He studied social science in University College Dublin, where he graduated with a double first, and he holds a master's in social policy from Goldsmiths, where he graduated with distinction. Seamus is going to tell us something about his PhD project today. He's long had an interest in hate crime and in disability hate crime in particular. He's going to say something about his research, and that's going to be followed by a response from Dr. Mark Walters, who's an alum of the Centre for Criminology here in Oxford, and is a Professor of Criminal Law and Criminology at Sussex Law School at the University of Sussex, where his research interests are focused primarily on hate crime studies, as well as criminal justice reform with a special emphasis on restorative justice. I think it's right to say that Mark is one of the leading scholars internationally in the area of hate crime, and I'm very much looking forward to hearing him today. On my immediate left is Mark Brookes, who I first met, I think in about 2005, when he worked with us in the CPS on hate crime issues, specifically disability hate crime issues. Mark is an advocate for people with, he's one of the country's leading disability campaigners. He is an advocate for people with learning difficulties and autism, and he holds an honorary doctorate from the University of Kent, which I think was awarded to you earlier this year. To my far left, Joanna, who I also knew during my years at the CPS when she was the Senior Policy Advisor, and really opened our eyes to disability hate crime as a specific problem in the English criminal justice speech system. One of the last speeches I made as DPP, and I've always since wished it had been one of the first speeches I made, was largely drafted by Joanna. I have to say that in the drafting of that speech and in our conversations about that speech, she opened my eyes to this issue, and I've always been grateful to you for that. I think you're going to interview Mark later, and Mark is going to speak about some of his personal experiences as a disabled person, and I've heard him speak before, and I'm looking forward to that very much. So, Seamus, would you like to start? Okay. And there'll be plenty of time for questions.
Thank you very much, Ken. And before I start, I would just say it's a testament to Ken's leadership that we're actually here at all, because he provided the national leadership when he headed the prosecution service that really brought disability hate crime into the foreground of the criminal justice system at that time. Okay, one other thing I'd just say before I start is I am an academic who has a substantial grounding in policy and practice. So I've spent a 35-year career, 25 years of which were spent in policy and practice, and then only 10 in academia. So I tend to describe myself by a term that some people regard as a bit of a cringe term, which is to say I'm a pracademic. So I'm an academic informed by practice, but also an academic who seeks to inform others' practice. So bear with me, we're a small but hopefully growing grouping within academia. The other thing I'd just say before I start is that as well as now having the privilege of reflecting and analysing hate crime as an issue, I've also got down and got dirty about it and worked on it. So I was a policy actor in this arena for a significant number of years. So some of the things that I'm now going to be reflecting on and analysing, I actually contributed to some of the challenges as well as the solutions that we face now. So when I'm critiquing the CPS and critiquing the police, I'm also critiquing some of the work that I did myself. So just to say that by way of introduction. what I'm going to cover, a little bit about the research that I did, the context within which we're having this discussion, the journey to disability hate crime, where it came from. I'm then primarily going to focus on interrogating vulnerability as it arises within disability hate crime, because that is the main challenge as I see it, and that's what I'm going to primarily talk about. I'm then going to also talk about disability prejudice and recognising ableism in the experience of disabled people, some conclusions and recommendations. So just to remind ourselves of what's the law in this area. Back in 2003, that was the days of New Labour government, and David Blunkett was the Home Secretary, and they led on the Criminal Justice Act of 2003. It was their flagship reform legislation for the whole criminal justice system, and one little piece within that was called Section 146, and it dealt with hostility on the grounds of disability, gender identity and sexual orientation. And it requires a court to take hostility into account at the point of sentencing. And that's become popularly referred to as disability hate crime. Disability within that act is defined very broadly as a physical or mental impairment, and hostility is regarded as it can be a hostility motivation that drives the offending, or hostility can be demonstrated at or around the time of the offending. So that's just by way of the law. I'm not going to spend too much time talking about legal issues, but just to set it in that context. The research that I did was based at Lancaster University in the law school there, and I undertook a triangulated study, 55 interviews with people in activism, politics and policy making on hate crime in England and Wales. I analysed the key policy documents produced by government, by the police, by prosecution in this area, and then I looked through all the cases of hate crime in 1 year, 2013-14, and selected from them 15 cases that I undertook a depth analysis of. As I was doing the research, I was drawn more and more to the work of two academics in the area of policy making. The work of John Kingdon, in the public policy academic in the States in Atlanta, and the work of Carl Backey in Australia in Adelaide University. And I was very much drawn to their ideas of the social construction of social problems, how an agenda gets set about an issue, the role played by activism, the role played by politics, and the role played by policy officials. Now, clearly in talking about hate crime, we know that, taking the long view of history, targeted violence against minorities has existed right back in time. If we go back to ancient Greece and Rome, you can find evidence of the banishment of disabled people from the cities. You can find evidence of targeted murders. You can trace that thread right throughout the experience. You can do that for other minoritized groups as well. But really what we're talking about when we talk about hate crime, in a way, is very old behaviour that we've placed in a new crime category. And it's both now a popular term, hate crime. It features quite often in the media debate, but it's also an established policy domain within where laws are being established, policies and procedures are being put in place. One of the most eminent theorists in the field is Barbara Perry at the University of Ontario in Canada, and she talks about hate crime as doing difference, and she talks about it as an attack on a person which has the effect of reproducing the unequal social order. So that she cites the example of the attack on the Asian corner shop, and the person who's attacked in that Asian corner shop and is, excuse my language, but it's just to convey the point, packy bashed. She says that there is the immediate victim, the person who experiences that crime, but there also is the message that goes from that crime to terrorise all people who share that same characteristic. And she says in doing that, it reminds people of their unequal place in the social order and reproduces it. And of course, the other thing about hate crime is that it doesn't exist in an ideological vacuum. It's linked fundamentally to ideologies of racism, sexism, homophobia, anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, or as I will argue in this instance, ableism. The OSCE has defined hate crime as a criminal offence with a bias dimension. I think that's quite a simple, straightforward definition. There have been a range of focusing events that have catalysed movement on hate crime, and absolutely seminal in the British context was the Lawrence inquiry. Also important in Britain was the impact of the Soho bomb, and more recently a second order and lower level impact came from the Pilkington case in the area of disability. But what you got in the area of hate crime, first in the States and then in Britain, was you got race and religious crimes legislated for first, and then you got sexuality, disability and gender identity coming later. And what I found a very strong sense of when I interviewed people as part of this research was a strong sense from disability activists of disability being last on the list, or being a last on the list, not being at the front of the hate crime agenda, or indeed not being at the front of the equality agenda overall. And that begs the question, why is disability a Johnny-come-lately in the hate crime domain? And the evidence would seem to point that there has existed two sets of ideologies, or two sets of paradigms that address disabled people. There's predominantly now today a welfare, care and protection paradigm, which is often described as safeguarding or a focus on vulnerable people, and then there is a rights and justice paradigm. And if you look at the impact of those paradigms, just taking it into the criminal justice domain, I was readily able to find 13 sentencing guidelines that define disabled people as inherently vulnerable, and a law, the Youth Justice and Criminal Evidence Act, that defines disabled people as inherently vulnerable. But in contrast, there is only one piece of legislation that defines a rights and justice focus on the disability experience, one focused on hate crime. So what you find is that the pervasive ideological addressing of disabled people is in terms of welfare, care and protection, and a much lesser focus in rights and justice, and you find that filtering into the hate crime domain and into criminal justice. Now, just for a moment to talk about where did this agenda come from? From the research that I did, which was the bulk of the research, was tracing the journey. What I found was that activists initiated this agenda. It was people like Joanna and Mark. It was people, a man, Nicholas Russell, who is now dead, who was actually a descendant of the famous Earl Russell. And it was those people back in the early 2000s who first started to talk about disabled people's experience as equivalent to racist experience, as equivalent to homophobic targeting. And they made an alliance with the then Disability Rights Commission, and they together, a number of them, approached a minister in the new Labour government, David Blunkett, and between them they seized a window of opportunity, which was the Criminal Justice Act, which was going through Parliament in 2003. And a group of activists went to Brighton, where the Labour Party were holding their conference, and David Blunkett was holding an open forum on the Criminal Justice Act. He had all his ministers with him, and in the audience were the activists. And up goes their hand, and they asked, what are you going to do about targeted crime, targeted against disabled people based on hostility? And they cited a case which was particularly compelling about an attack on a guard dog on a train that belonged to a disabled person, and an attack on that disabled person. David Blunkett said he was aware of the issue but not of the scale and the way in which they had described it. But he undertook to take it away and to take it into account as the legislation worked its way through Parliament. They didn't give him time to rest. The next day they were back. their chief executives on to the Home Secretary, reminding him of his commitment, and they stayed in touch. And Section 146 was introduced into the House of Lords as a government amendment in 2003. The interesting thing is that when the first work was happening on the drafting of the wording of it, the first wording that came out of the civil servants was about disability vulnerability. But David Blunkett and the activists were in the ascendancy at that time, and they put a lid on it and they silenced the vulnerability issue, such that hostility became the sole focus and it got onto the statute book as hate crime. So that's just by way of the origins, and it's important to recognise the key people, some of whom are in this room, who played a key role in that. Now, the key thing that I found with this research was that 16 years on from it being legislated for, disability and hate crime remains unsettled within the criminal justice system. Cases are still not successful at the rate you would expect them. There still is under-reporting, and there still is a tendency for cases to be flagged as cases involving a vulnerable victim who is experiencing the crime on the basis of their vulnerability rather than experiencing a crime driven by hostility. So what I actually did was the CPS gave me access to completed cases for one whole year, and that was the year 2013-14. There were 548 potentially flagged cases in that year. I wanted particularly to look at what was successful, because I wanted to see what really is working under this Act. And in order to get successful cases, I actually had to go through the whole 548. I didn't want to in the beginning, and I just got 6 successful cases. Now, I defined success as a case that went right through the system and had the outcome, the sentencing uplift, recorded on what's called a hearing record sheet at the very end. And I know that now, so many years later, there are far more successful cases than 6 in a year, but this was back 2013-14. I also looked at some failed cases, and I also looked at cases that didn't come to the CJS at all, and I looked at a murder case. There wasn't a murder in that one year, but I looked back a few years and got access to a file on a murder case. What was interesting as a backdrop to the cases overall, and it's something I wasn't particularly focused on, but it was a sense that came across to me, was a backdrop of poverty and social exclusion, both in the lives of the victims and perpetrators in a lot of these cases. And there was a sense that disabled victims were in some ways a scapegoat's scapegoat. That often you had socially excluded people targeting more marginalised and more socially excluded people. Now, the interesting thing was, I looked in depth at 15 cases. 12 of them came directly from the CPS case management system, 2 from NGOs and 1 from the independent statutory sector. Every one of the cases from the CPS had a flag written on it, vulnerable victim. So all 12 of them. And yet every disability activist that I interviewed rejected being classed as vulnerable. 100% of the people I interviewed. So what you find is that the criminal justice system uses this vulnerability categorisation with a very positive intent. It's actually like a shorthand for potential alert to services that you might need, or protective measures, that you might need special measures in court to give your evidence behind the screen, or to have an impact statement read on your behalf, or whatever. But when I looked through the 12 cases, only 3 of them had special measures applied, but all 12 were classified as vulnerable victims. And what I found from the research is that although that is very well intended, there's a potential for paternalism at best in using the vulnerability label, and more than that, there's a potential for a malign impact in that there's a potential to fail to deliver justice. What I found was that in the most serious cases, labelling a case as vulnerable victim occluded a focus on hostility. One of the cases I looked at was a murder, one of the cases was an enslavement case, and other cases as well. But what I found was that as those serious cases went through further along the criminal justice process, the hostility element slipped from view and the focus became the vulnerability. One of the cases I looked at was, I call it in senior, what I've handed out to you, Sunset, I think I call it Sunset Lodge. All the cases have been anonymised, I should have said that. And that case was about serious abuse by staff in a care home of disabled residents. The case was opened in court by the CPS as a case of hate crime. The council, I read their statement, was very clear that they were to prosecute it as hate crime, and their closing statement was about this being a case of hate crime and motivated by disability hostility. But as the case journeyed through the process, the judge left the disability hostility to one side and focused on a prosecution under mental health legislation. And the sense that was conveyed was this was easier to do and this was easier to secure a prosecution on. But even after that case concluded, the CPS and the police, in credit to them, both spoke about it as a case of disability hate crime, although the judge had not deemed it such. Now, what I also found was that the cases I looked at in detail, some of them had similarities to what you might call the classic hate crime case, the racist crime case of the kind of scenario where somebody gets a taxi from an ethnic minority taxi driver, they abuse the taxi driver getting out of the car without payment, they assault them, and they racially abuse them. That's the kind of seen as the sort of classic and risk of stereotyping hate crime case. But I found cases like that in relation to disability that happen in public space, that happen in that type of interaction. But what I equally found with disability was that there were cases that happened in contexts of abuse of power and exploitative relationships and relationships of trust. So some of these happened in care homes and some of them happened in other relationships where people worked for families or in relationships within a family. The interesting thing is that almost every successful disability case, hate crime case that I looked at, occurred outdoors. And almost every case that failed occurred indoors. And I think that's not insignificant, because what disability raises is those cases in contexts of exploitation and power abuse, which often happen hidden from view. And it's a different manifestation and a different environment. I've used the term, and somebody else has as well, that the different discriminations have different geographies of segregation. You know, people live their lives in different spaces, and we need to be able to flex how we think of hate crime in order that it can accommodate the ways in which people's different lives are lived. One of the things that came across strongly from my research was the limited engagement of the judiciary with this agenda to date. I interviewed judges at district court level, at a Crown Court, at the Central Criminal Court and at the Appeal Court. And judges spoke to me that they talked about we're very good on vulnerability, Seamus. And they talked about an intensified desire to address vulnerability. And they thought by doing that they were addressing disabled people's experience in the round. But what I found that judges, their decision making was absolutely critical. I came across cases where judges rejected a prosecutor's argument, and you have it in your pack. So a prosecutor was prosecuting a case as disability hate crime, and the judge said, no, this is not disability hostility, this is vulnerability targeting. I know this defendant, I've seen him before, he attacks vulnerable, that is disabled people. So embedded within judicial thinking is this view of equating disability and vulnerability. And clearly, judicial decision-making enlivens statute, and they are the main meaning makers of law. And there are very few appellate decisions yet in the law where they're based on a disability hate crime case. Most of the case law is based on race cases. So therefore, you're drawing on case law that's heavily within the race tradition. So I would argue that making further progress on this agenda, judicial engagement, is absolutely crucial. I think that central to further progress is seeing disability hostility and vulnerability targeting not as freestanding phenomena, but as social categories, socio-legal categories that police, prosecutors and judges create every day when they make a decision. You know, the file doesn't come with these flags on it. We make those decisions, we flag them, and in doing that, we place a frame around that case within which then we look at it. And categorising cases as either all about hostility or all about vulnerability is leading to justice failures. I think we need to hold the two in balance, not see them as opposite sides of a coin, but the same side of a coin, and that vulnerability targeting may simply be a variation in hostility targeting. If you take these disability hate crime cases and you take vulnerability out of them, there is no vulnerability without the disability. You know, vulnerability today is the master stereotype of disabled people in public policy, and it floods the disability experience. And therefore that leads me to argue that targeting people because they're vulnerable or because they have a vulnerable identity is a biased act, and it can be seen as a hostile act. Now, I want to, conscious of time, how am I doing?
Not too good too.
Not too good.
Well, you've technically got another 5 minutes.
Okay. What I will do is I will jump on to say a little bit about policy coding, and there are various documents that exist that codify the hate crime agenda, and I've been involved, as I said earlier, as contributing to some of these. The first is the law back in 2003, and that's very clear that the issue was about hostility. In 2007, the prosecution service produced a policy statement on disability hate crime, and it was in many ways good, but what it said was that it said some crimes are not driven by hostility, but they're because a person is vulnerable and not because the offender dislikes or hates disabled people. Now that fundamentally problematized the issue, because what it did, it mutually set hostility and vulnerability as two separate categories, and it set a very high threshold by saying that vulnerability targeting is outside the ambit of hate crime. And it reproduced the stereotype of disabled people as just vulnerable victims, rather than vulnerability being potentially an expression of hostility in itself. That led to real challenges in the 10 years that followed. It led to performance criticism from NGOs, it led to further legal guidance having to be issued, and it led to various frustrations. But we had developments. In 2017, the CPS produced a further statement, and it moved forward in many, many ways, because what it talked about was it actually made the focus on vulnerability problematic, and it began to critique it. But it did still qualify it by saying there are some crimes where the person is targeted because they're vulnerable and not because the offender dislikes disabled people. And examples were given. An example was given that of mate crime and crimes where there's a relationship of trust. Now, mate crime is crime based on fake friendship. It's like grooming. It's where you strike up a friendship with somebody in order to get into their world and then potentially get access to their property or get access to their money. One of the cases I've circulated to you is of the learning disabled man who was murdered, and he had been let out of an institution. He had been given 3,000 in benefit as he was leaving that institution, and he was approached by a group of fake friends. They befriended him over a period of 3 months. They dwindled his money down to his last fiver, and then they decided, what will we do to get the last fiver? And they beat him, and one of them got the fiver, and the man was beaten to death and died 3 days later. That's mate crime, but in the context of what the CPS seem to be saying is that's vulnerability. That wouldn't stack up as hate crime. And then relationships of trust. So the Sunset Lodge, the care home, is a relationship of trust. And yet there was stark hostility there where a staff member said to a person about, why not jump out the window, your life is useless anyway. So what you've got is a criminal justice system that's moving forward but is still focused on some of the problems going back to 2007, and the unsettled nature of the agenda continues. I would say that one or two things. This focus and obsession and kind of fashion of zoning in on vulnerability isn't unique to the criminal justice system. Now, if we were in the world of social care, housing, many areas, there's a focus on vulnerability. And loads of groups, young people, LGBT people, black and minority ethnic people, disabled people, women, are being classed as vulnerable. Scholars link this to a range of reasons. Frank Furedi calls it about the rise of therapy culture, this kind of constructing everybody as victims and a kind of perennial victimhood. Others link it to deepening inequalities linked to neoliberalism. People like Martha Feynman talk about vulnerability being universal. And now some feminists are beginning to talk about, well, maybe we should think of vulnerable being powerful, and that the way gay people repossess the notion of queer, that we should talk about the power of vulnerability. But disabled people don't go there yet. If we think about the origin of the word vulnerable, it comes from the Latin, and it's to be wounded. It's to carry a permanent wound. Now, you think of telling all women that they're wounded permanently, all black people, all gay people. And really what I'm arguing we need to do is that we need to lift and shift our gaze from the so-called wounded to the wounding society that constructs certain groups as wounded. And for the disabled people that I interviewed, vulnerability is a deficit concept. You know, it's seen as, and what also struck me very, very strongly was the total rejection of it, and yet the widespread use of it by well-intentioned policy officials. And I did interviews with policy officials and police people who said, I know, Seamus, that disabled people don't like it, many don't like it, but I find it useful. And I wouldn't use it to their face, but I use it internally because it's useful for my work. But I think in a way, that's like deciding to use a category of coloured people internally in an organisation today, instead of describing people as black, when if a group in this age of self-identification reject an identification as inherently vulnerable, why do we continue to use it? It begs that question. Obviously there's a constraint in that, as I said at the beginning, the law uses it. It's embedded in the Youth Justice and Criminal Evidence Act, and it's embedded in 13 different sentencing guidelines. And of course that raises the question that that places a constraint on progressive policing, it places a constraint on progressive prosecutors, and it places a constraint on progressive judges. I'm conscious of the time, and maybe I should stop and...
Well, there's going to be opportunity to say more.
Yeah.
I think it'd be good to open up the conversation. I think the next thing that's going to happen. Thank you very much, Seamus. Okay. That's a lot of food for thought.
Can answer questions about the disability, prejudice and the ableism, which I didn't talk about if people particularly want to ask.
Yeah, but we're going to try and keep a good half hour.
Yeah, I'm conscious of that.
Yeah.
Sorry.
So Mark, you were going to respond.
I might actually find move the laptop over there.
Oh, sure, yeah.
Okay. Many thanks first of all for the kind invitation from Lord Macdonald to speak at the Human Rights Forum. It's very exciting for me to be back at Oxford University. I finished my DPhil here in 2011 at the Centre for Criminology on hate crime. So it's great to be back to talk about hate crime, and particularly disability hate crime. And I'd also like to congratulate Dr. Taylor on completing his PhD. Very well done. And also for inviting me to respond to his paper. I think he's done quite a shrewd move in doing so, because both of our research comes to a very similar conclusion. So I think it's going to be less of a critique and more of a supporting act, actually, over the next 15 minutes, or will it? We'll see. So also really impressive that you've, within a PhD, managed to review over 500 disability case reports and conducted 55 interviews. So, you know, a real big feat in terms of what you can do as a single researcher in a PhD. So, very well done indeed. More than I did in mine. So, not that I'm jealous, of course. Right, okay. So, the real big issue that comes through in, I'll call you Seamus rather than Dr. Sayers, very much my form, isn't it? In Seamus's thesis really is whether this issue of hostility really works in terms of describing what disability hate crime is. And of course the key issue here is perceived vulnerability. And through his case study analysis, what really brings to life really is disabled people's experiences of both ableism and disableism. The very detailed account you provided also of the policy developments in this area over the last 10 to 15 years show how the latter really is not sufficiently meeting the needs of the former. And I think what we particularly need to understand is how we understand the phenomenon of disability hate crime, not as individual, isolated acts of bigotry or of prejudice towards disabled people, but we need to understand more the context, the structural context in which disableism and ableism occurs. And you refer nicely throughout your case studies to situations of disabled people being victimised by people who they know. And I know from my own research on hate crime that about 50% of reported disability hate crimes are committed by someone known to the victim. People such as carers, family members, or as you refer to, make crime, people who befriend individuals who are disabled, sometimes moving into their homes in order to take their money, their welfare payments, to use their property to sell drugs. We refer to this commonly as cuckooing. When we understand these types of incidents, which often lead, in many cases, to sometimes torture, to very, very disturbing, brutal cases of disabling hate crimes resulting in the murder of the victim, we don't understand them as being about hostility, which is the word used in the legislation. It's often used in terms of vulnerability. And what's particularly problematic about this is that the courts, and in particular the judges, are still referring to these cases not about hate or hostility or prejudice or bias, using the word vulnerability in their judgments and in their sentencing decisions. And when they refer to sentencing guidelines, they frequently refer to, we are going to increase the sentence of this particular offender because of the vulnerability of the victim. And even when the CPS have done quite a good job actually at saying, look, this is a case of hostility. There is evidence here that when you pick on someone because of their perceived vulnerability, if you think of them as weaker than other people, if you are going to show them no respect as human beings, this is about bias, this is about prejudice, this is about dislike. The court still refuse to acknowledge that, and again will emphasise instead the issue of vulnerability. And what does that do? Well, it serves to infantilise disabled people. It places them in a position of perceived weakness, as if their disability and vulnerability is innate. When we know, of course, from the social model of disability studies, that it's the social context in which we, as non-disabled societies, put disabled people into, which is then causal to their perceived vulnerability and the increased likelihood that they will be targeted for abuse. Now, courts and judges give meaning to law. Now, through repeated iterations of judgments which say, these cases are not about bias, they are not about discrimination, they are not about hate. Repeated iterations that say this is about vulnerability serves only to perpetuate the stereotypes and the biases that we hold about disabled people. So they themselves, the courts themselves, are feeding in to this environment, to the social context in which disability hate crime occurs. Now, this is the key issue. However, there are other barriers to justice when prosecuting disability hate crime that we need to be mindful of, especially when we move towards law reform. The first thing to note is that there is a lack of parity in the current framework of hate crime legislation. When it comes to race and religion, there are specific criminal offences, i.e. offences in the criminal law, which allow the prosecution to charge someone with, for example, racially aggravated assault. And that comes with an increased sentence maximum. That's not the case for disability hate crime. Disability hate crime falls under a separate piece of legislation that applies only at sentencing. The CPS cannot charge, for example, disability aggravated assault. It doesn't exist in law. And this creates what we call a hierarchy. Some types of hate crime are treated more seriously because they have a higher sentencing maximum. Disability hate crime is treated not in the criminal law, but in sentencing provisions only. So we have disparity, and that means that there might be unequal protection in law. We also need to be mindful of the fact that there are different types of offences which are committed against disabled people in terms of hate crime. 38% of prosecuted disability hate crimes were sexual or property related. Those figures much higher for disability than other types of hate crime. Those crimes are not covered in the criminal law when we look at both race and religion in terms of aggravated offences. So they're just not covered. They're not thought of in terms of these are the types of hate crimes which are occurring in society and that need to be prescribed in the criminal law. Now, a study that we conducted at the University of Sussex called The Life Cycle of Hate Crime looked at how the provisions under the Criminal Justice Act were being applied in practice. And we found that time and time again, the hostility element for disability hate crimes in particular was being filtered out of the system. It was being dropped out of the system. Why is that? Well, a key reason is that it doesn't make up a part of a substantive offence. So when the police are collating evidence to prosecute a disability hate crime, they don't have to. The urgency of collating evidence of disability hostility isn't there because they don't have to prove it in court in order to get the conviction. So quite often it is filtered out of the system because the evidence isn't collated in the first place, given to the CPS so they can take it to court and try and prove it. Of course, the issue of vulnerability then is the next hurdle. When you get the evidence, you get to court, you get to the end, and the judge says, no thanks, we're going to use vulnerability instead. Now this, and not this only, this generates what we call a justice gap. The justice gap is the gap between the number of crimes, hate crimes that are reported to the police, and those which result in a conviction, and in terms of hate crime, that there's also the application of hate crime legislation. That means that the disability hostility provisions are applied in that case. The percentage that fall out is the justice gap. Okay, so there are many reasons for there to be a justice gap. People often they don't want to take the case forward, or it might be out of court, but there's evidence to show that this issue of perceived vulnerability and the filtering out of disability hate crime within the process results, or at least adds towards this justice gap. So what does that look like in terms of numbers? Now, hate crime in general, we know that in the year 2017 to 18, these are the most recent statistics where we have the full life cycle here, there are an estimated 184,000 hate crimes committed in England based on the crime survey for England and Wales. There was an estimated 97,000 reported to the police. 94,000 were recorded by the police. Figures massively improved, by the way, over the last few years. Resulting in 14,000 prosecutions, so you can see how many are now being filtered out of the system. They're falling away as we go through the criminal process, resulting in 11,000 convictions, but only 7,700 of those convictions also resulted in the application of the hate crime law provisions. That means that they got an enhanced sentence, and the judge agreed, yes, this was aggravated by hostility. 92% of cases that come to the attention of the police do not result in conviction and application of hate crime legislation. 8% do. When we look at the numbers for disability hate crimes, they are troubling. 52,000 disability hate crimes estimated to have been committed during that year. We don't have the estimates for how many were reported. We do know the number that was recorded by the police, 7,000. That's likely to be a very low number, very cautious estimate there, because there would be a lot more reported but not recorded by the police as disability hate crimes, resulting in 133 cases that resulted in conviction and application of the Criminal Justice Act, Section 146. In other words, 1.8% of cases that are reported to the police, or recorded by the police I should say, result in the application of hate crime legislation. If we look at the actual estimated numbers, we know that 0.2% of the estimated number of disability hate crimes that occur in society result in a conviction and the application of hate crime legislation. And those numbers, by the way, have vastly improved over the last few years, thanks to some of the work of the CPS and the courts recognising disability hate crime. I'm still not convinced that they're quite there yet in terms of the numbers that we might like to see if we are to say that we have a framework of laws that are being successfully applied and that justice is being served. How much time have we got? Have we run out?
Well, you need to wrap up quite soon because I want to have time for questions.
Sure. It's my last slide, so I'll this is the technical part, and so I'm not going to go on too long because I don't have enough time. But law reform, how do we improve the justice gap? How do we change this issue of perceived vulnerability outside of just the policy domain in terms of change the law? Well, first of all, we need to ensure that there's parity in the law. Disability hate crime needs to be treated in law the same as It's other types of hate crime. We can't have this framework, this fragmented, hierarchical framework of law, making sure that disability hate crime is treated as seriously as other types of hate crime. And I think that is best done through the criminal law, not sentencing provisions. And I can talk about that further if you want to know why that is. The second is that we need to have a new legal test, I believe, for disability hate crime. The test of hostility that's used in law is just not fit for purpose. There is a literal interpretation of what hostility is in law, and it does not fit with the nature and dynamics of disability prejudice. So we need to change the test. And I would argue that that test should be what's called a by reason test. That if a crime is committed by reason of the victim's disability, that should be a hate crime in law. That means you wouldn't have to prove a slur that's used in the heat of the moment, which is quite often the case in many hate crimes. You wouldn't have to show what's called an outward manifestation of prejudice, but what you would have to prove is that someone is selected, that victim was selected by the offender because of their perceived disability. Now, there is quite a controversial debate as to whether that could work in our system or whether it should work, and I'm happy to discuss it, but I've run out of time. That is the test I believe that would allow us to have many more successful prosecutions for disability hate crime and to start to move away from the issue of perceived vulnerability and how it creates barriers to justice for victims of disability hate crime. Thank you.
Joanna Perry, whose policy work in this area has been absolutely transformational, not just in the United Kingdom but abroad, is going to have a conversation with Mark.
Thank you. Mark, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, both presentations have been really interesting and some far over the top for me as well. So some of the things that we said were a bit, jargony, should I say?
Sorry.
I know we were talking when we were preparing today about issues of reporting. Some of the issues that people face. Well, first of all, we were talking about how many years you've been working in this field and how many people you've met who have experienced this type of disability hate crime and targeting. And I think, can we estimate how many people you've spoken to in the last 20 years?
Over 1,000, definitely over 1,000. I would say even within the I'm and Sam project, it's been over 1,000, so maybe a lot more than that.
And I'm Sam is a campaign by Dimensions.
Yeah, for people with learning disabilities and autism.
Looking at hate crime.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so what are the things that people are saying, are telling you?
Many people have said that they won't report it because they might not believe. They're still, even now, afraid to go into the police station because they're afraid of a police station. People were also saying to me, oh, it happens to me every day, so they think it's a normal thing and that they won't be believed. And even now, people don't know what actually a hate crime is.
And one thing you're talking about as well is about this kind of tricky thing of labels.
Yes, in the last few years, labels have come up quite a lot around labelling people. So invisible labelling, learning difficulties, and invisible labelling as well. So it's confused, I think, all organisations around saying, what is a learning disability?
And how do people feel? You might want to talk about how you feel being given that label.
I mean, me personally, I don't like using any labels, but when I have to, I will use it.
So, yeah, there's this, there is a debate, I think, in this work about that people don't necessarily want to self-identify as being disabled and is taking on the label that we've just heard is actually a negative label. And so there's this quote by someone else I read that was saying, the price of being heard is that you need to keep the label of disabled, so you have to self-identify. On the other hand, last week when we were talking, we went to speak to a group of people with learning difficulties about their experiences of disability hate crime and what happened in that meeting.
Yeah, a guy who I've met a few times before and who hadn't spoken about his issue came and spoke to me about it, and after 23 years of not saying anything and didn't know how to approach, he came up to me and talked to me about his problem and was able to give advice, and then he came back to the group and was able to speak to the group.
And why do you think he came to speak to you?
Probably because I was kind of on his level, so I'd been there, I'd listened to lots of other people and also gave advice as well.
Yeah, and it's that sort of recognition, I suppose, and when we're thinking about today, I think we're kind of starting from the other side about reporting. We've been talking about the outcome, Section 146, but there's all this happening before it even gets anywhere near the police, if it gets to the police, and you've already mentioned some of the reasons why not. And I think what's so important is that whatever reform we have, we need to create these spaces and these relationships and these opportunities for people to talk to someone about what's happened. And I think you're probably one of, maybe the only person, maybe you're one of a very small group of people who have this label, who are working in the field, actually employed full-time by an organisation, and an expert who people can actually come to and speak to about their experiences. So can the law and all of our ideas about the law create these spaces and help people report into some kind of support, report into some kind of safety and security and reduced risk, and into justice, which might or might not be criminal justice, right?
Yeah, no, absolutely. There are third-party reporting places around, but then people don't know where they actually are. So it's very hard if people want to report a hate crime, and if they don't want to go to the police, they don't know where to go to.
Yeah. Might just be one point about the international side, and then before we want to open it up, can I say something about them? So I worked a bit on in the international sphere on hate crime generally, but and many countries, most countries in Europe have some kind of disability hate crime provision. Some of the provisions are, the discrimination model, the by reason of model. But actually England and Wales is by far the leader, notwithstanding all of the issues that we've heard today, but it is by far the leader in terms of the outcomes, in terms of the number of recorded crimes, reported crimes, number of investigators prosecuted and sentenced. Now that might make you feel even worse about the state of where we are, but I think that that's partly because of the very active policy. That there's been so much action at the policy level, there have been relationships between policymakers, practitioners, people working, activists, I suppose, groups themselves, and that has developed some excellent policy and practice. But with cuts, and especially with cuts to groups, such as the group we had last week, which are getting closed down, these spaces for connection and this development of policy and activism, is disappearing. So people are trying to safeguard the progress that they've made, let alone trying to make progress. They're trying to make sure they don't go 2 steps back. And what is the role of law there, and law reform, and can law actually oblige public authorities to make investments in support, investments in training, investments in policy development? There are some countries that do have those obligations, and the Victims Directive might support that, but that's enough of that jargon. So that was one of the points. So yeah.
Good. Well, we're good. Can I just ask you, Mark,
Yeah.
a personal question, if you don't mind? I've asked you this before. How frequently do you encounter hostility?
Well, I actually reported a hate crime against me last year. I was very quickly. I was coming home late from work in a like this, very cold and very dark. And the next thing I knew, these guys who were used in a car pulled up alongside me as I was walking home. First of all, started calling me names, and then threw something at me, and then quickly laughed and drove off. So yeah, it took me a long time to report it because I'm quite confident and I brushed it off. But we've been in a campaign kind of role. I was doing the training with police in Surrey, and so they bantered, they every time I used to speak about it, they said, "Luke, come and report it to us afterwards, come on." I used to get told off actually, saying you should report it. So I did eventually report it, and it was logged. But unfortunately, nothing's been done because I couldn't describe the use, couldn't say what colour, because it was dark and it was and I couldn't recognise the car or the people in the car.